a journey through the 9 fundamental works of Friedrich Nietzsche, guided by his most famous quotes and accompanied by a philosophical interpretation applied to the human experience. What if much of what you consider true were not really your own? What if many of your beliefs, your values, and even the way you interpret your life had been inherited from people you never chose? What if some of the certainties that have accompanied you all your life were precisely what prevents you from understanding who you are? More than a century ago, a philosopher dared to ask questions so profound and so uncomfortable that they still challenge the way we understand life today. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche. Few figures have been so widely quoted and, at the same time, so widely misunderstood as he has. His quotations appear in books, lectures, social media, and motivational speeches. Yet behind those isolated quotes lies a complex, profound, and rigorous philosophical body of work. Nietzsche did not write to offer comfort. He did not write to confirm existing beliefs, much less to create followers. He wrote because he perceived a profound transformation taking place in Western culture. A crisis of meaning, a crisis of values, a crisis of identity, and in the face of that crisis, his work does not offer definitive answers, but rather a path of questioning. The central question is, how do we live when the certainties that once sustained our lives begin to disappear? In this video, we will explore his fundamental works in chronological order. Not as a biography, but as a method of philosophical reading. Each work will be analyzed using the same structure. First, the context and central idea of the book. Then, an authentic quote taken directly from the work. And finally, a philosophical interpretation applied to the human experience, to understand how these ideas remain relevant today. Because Nietzsche's thought belongs not only to his own time, it continues to question ours. This journey does not seek definitive answers. It seeks to understand the essential questions of existence. Questions about suffering, truth, morality, and identity. And how these questions run through every stage of his work. The first major stage of this journey begins in 1872. With his first major work, Work No. 1, The Birth of Tragedy. This was Friedrich Nietzsche's first major work. In it, he delves into ancient Greek culture to understand a question that runs throughout all of human history. Why do we continue to say yes to life when we know it includes pain, loss, and death? Nietzsche finds an answer in 2 symbolic forces present in Greek tragedy. 2 forces he called the Apollonian and the Dionysian. The Apollonian represents form, order, clarity, measure, the human tendency to impose structure even where reality does not always have it. The Dionysian represents the vital impulse, passion, chaos, the intensity of existing, that which breaks boundaries and exposes the human being to the direct experience of existence. And when both forces come together in Greek tragedy, something extraordinary happens. The human being can look into the abyss of existence and still say yes to life. Featured quote, only as an aesthetic phenomenon are existence and the world eternally justified. The birth of tragedy. This quote does not mean that life is a decorative work of art. It means that existence gains depth when we are able to contemplate it in all its complexity. With its beauty, but also with its wounds. Philosophical interpretation applied to the human experience. Much of human suffering arises from a silent expectation. The expectation that life should be different from what it is. We want joy without loss, success without failure, love without vulnerability, security without uncertainty, yet the human experience seems to be built precisely upon those tensions. Perhaps fulfillment does not consist in eliminating life's contradictions. Perhaps it consists in learning to inhabit them, instead of denying what we are, learning to affirm it as it presents itself. And that question leads us to the next stage of his thought. Because if we want to understand our lives, we must first ask ourselves how many of our certainties are truly our own. Work number 2, Human, All Too Human, The Origin of Our Beliefs and the Value of Doubt. In 1878, Nietzsche published a work that marked a decisive turning point in his thinking. Much of the influence of German Romanticism was left behind. So too was his admiration for Wagner. It was the beginning of a more analytical philosophy, one more willing to question what had been regarded as unquestionable for centuries. Nietzsche then turned his attention to something extraordinarily close and, at the same time, difficult to observe, our beliefs. Those ideas we usually consider self-evident, those convictions we rarely subject to examination, those certainties that ultimately shape the way we interpret the world. One of the challenges that runs through this book is precisely distinguishing between what is true and what we have simply inherited. Custom, education, tradition, culture, family, All of these quietly participate in constructing our view of reality. Yet we rarely stop to ask, to what extent do our ideas truly belong to us? Featured quote, "Convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies." Friedrich Nietzsche, Human, All Too Human, aphorism 483. This statement may seem exaggerated. After all, we usually think that the danger comes from falsehoods. However, there is something deeper here. A lie can be uncovered. It can be corrected. It can be questioned. Absolute conviction, on the other hand, tends to protect itself. It stops searching. It stops asking. It stops listening. And when an idea is no longer examined, it begins to turn into an invisible prison. Philosophical interpretation applied to the human experience. There is an experience common to virtually every human being. At some point in life, we discover that certain ideas we believed were our own had simply been inherited. Perhaps a definition of success, a belief about love, a view of failure, a way of understanding happiness. For years, we may pursue goals we never consciously chose. We may defend values we never analyzed. We may live according to expectations that belong to others. The proposal that emerges from this book is not to replace one set of beliefs with another. It is more radical than that, to learn how to think, to learn how to examine, to learn to be suspicious even of what seems most self-evident. Because the growth of consciousness does not begin when we find new answers. It begins when we dare to ask new questions. And once the old certainties begin to crack, an even more unsettling question arises. What happens when the foundations upon which an entire culture has built its sense of existence disappear? That is the question the next work will explore. Work number 3, Daybreak, Moral Prejudices and the Courage to Think for Oneself. In 1881, Nietzsche published a work that many consider the silent turning point of his philosophy. In Daybreak, Nietzsche begins to dig beneath the foundations of morality. Not to destroy it, but to ask an uncomfortable question. Where do what we call good and evil really come from? Were they born from reason? From God? Or simply from custom, repeated over generations until we forgot that it was once nothing more than that, a custom? For centuries, morality was presented as something given, as if good and evil existed in the same way that mountains or rivers do. Nietzsche distrusts this apparent certainty. He observes that what one era considers virtuous, another regarded as dangerous. That what one culture rewards, another punishes. From this arises a suspicion. Perhaps morality was not discovered, but constructed, little by little, by entire generations that accumulated fears, conveniences, and customs until those customs came to seem like universal laws. Nietzsche then turned his attention to something we rarely question, our own feelings. That inner voice we call intuition, heart, or moral instinct. That voice we genuinely believe to be our own. Highlighted quotations. 1. Letting ourselves be guided by our feelings is equivalent to obeying our grandfather, our grandmother, and their grandparents. Friedrich Nietzsche, Daybreak. This sentence dismantles one of our most cherished certainties. The idea that feeling something deeply makes it true. Nietzsche suggests the opposite. A feeling is not a starting point, it is an endpoint. Behind every emotion lies an inherited judgment, silently passed down from generation to generation until it became disguised as instinct. When we believe we are listening to our heart, we are often only hearing the echo of those who came before us. 2. The higher we rise, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly. Friedrich Nietzsche, Daybreak. Thinking for oneself comes at a cost. Whoever rises, whoever dares to question what has been inherited, inevitably begins to seem distant, strange, even insignificant in the eyes of those who remain below, bound to what is familiar. Not because they have become smaller, but because those who cannot fly can only measure height as distance, never as freedom. Philosophical interpretation applied to human experience. There is an experience that almost all of us go through sooner or later. The suspicion that some of our strongest moral convictions, what we consider just, decent, or right, were not chosen by us. We inherited them, from our family, from religion, from the culture that surrounded us from the cradle, and for years, we may have acted according to that moral sense without ever asking where it came from. The proposal of Daybreak is not to abandon morality, much less to become indifferent to good and evil. It is something far more demanding, to examine even what feels most intimate and self-evident. To ask whether our indignation, our guilt, and our idea of virtue truly arose from our own reflection, or whether we simply inherited the voices of others and called them conscience. And whoever begins that examination soon discovers the price of rising above, the incomprehension of those who prefer not to look down, not to question the ground beneath their feet. Yet it is precisely that discomfort that drives Nietzsche toward an ever more radical question, one that will require a far bolder answer than mere suspicion. That is the question he will explore in the next work. Work number 4, The Gay Science, The Loss of Certainties and the Search for Meaning. In 1882, Nietzsche published one of the most decisive works of his entire philosophical career. At first glance, the title may be misleading. The Gay Science is not a book about superficial joy or naive optimism. It is an exploration of one of the deepest transformations in human history, the disappearance of ancient certainties. Throughout its pages, Europe is changing, science is advancing, reason is questioning centuries-old traditions, religious institutions are losing authority, and little by little, the foundations that had given meaning to existence for centuries begin to weaken. For many, this represented liberation, but also danger, because when inherited answers disappear, an inevitable question arises. How do we live when we no longer know with certainty why we live? Highlighted quotes. 1. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. Friedrich Nietzsche, The Gay Science, Aphorism 125, The Madman. Probably no other sentence in all of his work has been quoted as often, or misunderstood as much. It is not a celebration. It is not a cry of triumph. It is a diagnosis. This is not about the literal death of a deity. It describes the collapse of a system of beliefs that, for centuries, provided meaning, guidance, and moral foundations to much of Western culture. The truly important question is not the death of God. The question is what happens afterward. What happens when that which gave meaning to existence disappears? 2. This life, as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more. Friedrich Nietzsche, The Gay Science, Aphorism 341, The Greatest Weight. The sentence is not a condemnation. It is a question disguised as a statement. What would happen if you had to live this exact same life over and over again, forever? Every decision, every joy, every mistake, every loss, every moment, would you accept it, reject it, or embrace it completely? It is an experiment in consciousness, an invitation to ask ourselves how fully we truly affirm our own existence. Philosophical interpretation applied to the human experience. Although the first quote was written in a specific cultural context, the experience it describes is profoundly human. We all go through moments when some fundamental certainty collapses. A relationship ends, a project fails, a belief no longer convinces us, an identity built over years begins to crack, and suddenly we discover that what once guided us can no longer do so. These are moments of uncertainty, but they are also moments of possibility, because when old answers stop working, the opportunity arises to examine who we really are. Not to find a definitive truth, but to consciously participate in the construction of meaning. The absence of certainty can produce vertigo, but it can also open a space for freedom, a demanding freedom, a freedom that does not consist of doing whatever we want, but of accepting the responsibility to decide what we value, what we stand for, and what meaning we give to our existence. And the second quote takes that question even further. It does not ask what you want to change. It asks whether you would be capable of loving your life exactly as it is. With everything it includes, with everything that hurts, with everything that did not turn out as you expected. That is the most demanding test this book presents. And that question leads us directly to the work that many consider the heart of all of Nietzsche's thought. A work in which he will attempt to answer what a human being can become when they no longer depend on inherited certainties. That work is Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Work number 5, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Self-Transformation and the Creation of Values. Between 1883 and 1885, Nietzsche wrote the work he considered the most important of his entire philosophical production. But he does not present it as an academic treatise. He does not construct systematic arguments. He does not develop concepts in a conventional way. Instead, he creates a philosophical narrative starring Zarathustra, a character who descends from the mountains to share a teaching that profoundly challenges the way human beings understand their existence. This work emerges after the crisis announced in The Gay Science. If the old certainties have disappeared, if inherited values no longer possess the same authority, then an inevitable question arises. How should we live? How should we find our direction? How should we build meaning? The answer is not a new set of universal rules. It is something far more demanding. The possibility of transforming oneself. Highlighted quotations. 1. Man is something that shall be overcome. Friedrich Nietzsche, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Prologue, Section 3. This sentence is not about superiority over others. It is not about domination. It is not about competition. It speaks of what every human being can become when they stop living from fear, conformity, and dependence on values they never chose. The Übermensch is not a fixed goal. It is a direction, an invitation not to stop at what one already is. 2. Man is a rope stretched between the animal and the Übermensch, a rope over an abyss. Friedrich Nietzsche, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Prologue, Section 4. One of the most powerful images in all of philosophy. The human being is not a destination. It is a bridge, a passage, a movement between what one was and what one can become. And that abyss is not a threat. It is the very depth of existence. What matters is not reaching a final destination. What matters is understanding that the human being is a process, an open possibility, a constant transformation, philosophical interpretation applied to the human experience. Much of human life unfolds amid expectations. The expectations of family, of society, of culture, of the groups to which we belong. We often learn who we are supposed to be before asking who we want to be. And that difference can stay with us for years, even for an entire lifetime. Many people live seeking approval, seeking security, seeking to fit in, not because they are weak, but because facing the uncertainty of building a life of one's own requires courage. The transformation Zarathustra speaks of does not consist in becoming someone extraordinary in the eyes of others. It consists in developing the ability to live from genuine conviction, to assume responsibility for our choices, to stop hiding behind excuses, traditions, or other people's expectations. This work also introduces one of the most powerful metaphors in all of Nietzsche's philosophy: the camel, the lion, and the child. First comes the camel. It represents the individual who carries obligations, rules, and duties. It is the stage of obedience. Then comes the lion. The lion learns to say no. It questions, it challenges, it breaks chains, but negation alone is not enough. That is why the child finally appears, the symbol of creation, of spontaneity, of the ability to begin again, of saying yes to life. Human maturity does not consist solely in rebelling against what is established. It consists in developing the ability to create values, to create meaning, to create a unique way of inhabiting existence. Are we living according to our deepest convictions? Or are we simply playing a role that we learned long ago? Because the greatest tragedy was not failure. The greatest tragedy was reaching the end of life without ever having tried to become what one was capable of becoming. However, once we begin to build our own values, a new difficulty arises. How can we distinguish between an authentic search for truth and the ideas we inherited without examining them? How can we stop interpreting the world solely through inherited values and begin to create our own perspective on existence? Work number 6. Beyond Good and Evil: The Freedom to Think Beyond Inherited Certainties. In 1886, 1 year after completing Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a work was published that Nietzsche himself considered a kind of complement and clarification of the ideas he had previously developed. Many readers had interpreted Zarathustra as a poetic and enigmatic work. This book returns to direct philosophical analysis, but not to offer comfortable answers. Rather, to challenge one of the deepest tendencies of human thought: the need to believe that our ideas are definitive truths. Throughout history, philosophers, religious leaders, politicians, and thinkers have claimed to possess the truth. They have built complete systems to explain the world. They have defined what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is evil. But this book raises an uncomfortable question. What if many of those truths were actually interpretations? What if, behind our convictions, there were impulses, interests, fears, or needs that we rarely acknowledge? Truly free thinking begins when we stop assuming that our beliefs are self-evident and begin to examine them. Highlighted quotes. 1. Whoever fights monsters should be careful not to become a monster as well. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. Friedrich Nietzsche, Beyond Good and Evil, Aphorism 146. One of the deepest and most psychological reflections in all of his work. We often think that danger lies outside ourselves, in what we fight, in what we reject, in what we consider wrong. But every prolonged confrontation transforms us. Struggle changes the one who struggles. Resistance changes the one who resists. And when a person devotes all of their energy to fighting something, they run the risk of becoming precisely what they were trying to overcome. 2. There are no moral phenomena, only a moral interpretation of phenomena. Friedrich Nietzsche, Beyond Good and Evil, Aphorism 108. This statement anticipates one of the central themes that he would later develop in On the Genealogy of Morality. It is not saying that everything is relative or that nothing matters. It points out that human beings constantly interpret reality, and many times we confuse our interpretations with absolute facts. What one era considers a virtue, another may consider a weakness. What one culture celebrates, another may reject. History shows that many of our moral certainties have changed again and again. Philosophical interpretation applied to human experience. Human experience is full of oppositions. We fight injustice. We fight our fears. We fight habits we want to leave behind. We fight systems we consider harmful. However, there is one question we rarely ask ourselves. What effect does that struggle have on us? A person may fight intolerance and end up becoming intolerant. They may fight arrogance and become arrogant. They may fight control and end up trying to control others. Awareness does not consist solely of analyzing the external world. It also consists of watching the silent transformations that take place within us. At the same time, we all observe reality through filters. Our education, our culture, our personal history, our wounds, our desires, all of these influence the way we interpret the world. Recognizing this reality does not make us weaker. It makes us more aware, more prudent, more open to the complexity of human experience. Because wisdom does not consist of clinging tightly to our certainties. It consists of maintaining the ability to examine them. If our beliefs can be examined, if our interpretations can change, if our truths have a history, then an inevitable question arises. Where do our values really come from? Who decided what should be considered good? Who decided what should be considered evil? And what historical forces took part in the construction of those ideas? Work number 7, The Genealogy of Morals, The Origin of Our Values and the Construction of Conscience. In 1887, one of the most influential and provocative works of his entire philosophical career was published. Up to this point in Nietzsche's thought, developed in his earlier works, inherited certainties had been questioned. Beliefs had been examined, truths that seemed unshakable had been called into doubt. Now the focus turns to something even deeper, morality, that which allows us to distinguish between what is right and what is wrong, between good and evil, between what deserves approval and what deserves rejection. But the question that opens this book is not whether our values are true or false. It is a different question, a question that very few thinkers had dared to ask. Where do our values come from? Because before deciding whether an idea is valid, perhaps we should understand how it came into being. Who created it, and what human needs contributed to shaping it? Morality did not descend from heaven, nor did it appear spontaneously. It has a history, and every history leaves traces. Highlighted quotations. 1. We must, for once, call into question the value of values themselves. Friedrich Nietzsche, on the Genealogy of Morals, Preface. This is the question that changes everything. It is not about replacing one set of values with another. It is about something more radical, examining why we believe something has value. Since when, and for whom, events happen, but human beings assign meanings to them. We interpret, we evaluate, we judge, and over time, we end up forgetting that our evaluations are historical constructions. We begin to perceive them as self-evident truths, as if they had always existed, as if they could not be otherwise. 2. Fear is the mother of morality. Friedrich Nietzsche, on the Genealogy of Morals, 1887. A statement that is unsettling precisely because it touches on something real. Not all morality is born from love or wisdom. Sometimes it is born from fear of punishment, fear of rejection, fear of being excluded from the group. And when a rule is built upon fear, its purpose is not to liberate. It is to restrain. The question that then arises is unavoidable. How many of the rules we follow were born from fear? And how many were born from genuine conviction? Philosophical interpretation applied to human experience. Most of us inherit an enormous number of judgments about how we should live. What it means to succeed, what it means to fail, what it means to be a good person, what it means to have a meaningful life. But we rarely examine the origin of those definitions. And yet, many of the inner tensions we experience arise precisely from there. Sometimes we pursue goals we do not truly desire. Sometimes we feel guilty for decisions that reflect our deepest convictions. Sometimes we live divided between what we feel and what we believe we should feel. This book invites us to undertake an inner investigation, not to destroy all values, but to understand which ones are truly our own. There is also an experience that many human beings know well, the inner voice that never seems satisfied, the constant demand, the feeling of never being enough. The guilt that persists even when no one is accusing us. The question that arises is fundamental. Does that voice represent our deepest conscience? Or does it represent norms, expectations, and judgments that we have absorbed without examining them? It is not about eliminating all self-criticism. It is about distinguishing between a conscience that helps us grow and a conscience that keeps us trapped in guilt. Because a mature conscience is not one that obeys automatically. It is one that understands the origin of what it obeys. Many of the ideas we consider sacred may not be eternal. They may have a history. They may have a human origin. And if that is true, then no belief should be exempt from philosophical examination. No tradition, no institution, no ideal. Work number 8, The Twilight of the Idols. Bringing down the certainties that sustain our way of thinking. In 1888, 1 year before the final collapse of his conscious life, Nietzsche wrote one of the most direct, brief, and forceful works of his entire career. The Twilight of the Idols is not a systematic text. It is a rapid philosophical intervention, almost an intellectual hammer blow. The goal is not to build a new system, it is to evaluate the existing systems, and to strike the ideas that the West had revered for centuries without subjecting them to deep criticism. He calls these pillars of thought idols. Beliefs accepted as true, values assumed to be universal, concepts that are rarely examined because they seem self-evident. The question that runs through this book is radical. What if many of the most important truths of Western culture had not been discovered, but constructed? Highlighted quotes. 1. What does not kill me makes me stronger. Friedrich Nietzsche, The Twilight of the Idols, Maxims and Arrows, Aphorism 8. One of the most quoted lines in all of his work, and also one of the most misunderstood. It is not about glorifying suffering. It is about observing how the experience of reaching one's limits transforms the inner structure of the human being. Crises do not only wound, they also reorganize. They destroy ways of living that no longer serve, but at the same time, they can reveal abilities that were not previously visible. Suffering does not by itself determine the meaning of an experience. It is consciousness that gives it direction. 2. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Friedrich Nietzsche, The Twilight of the Idols, Maxims and Arrows, Aphorism 12. A quote that complements the previous one with a different kind of depth. It is not enough to survive what hurts. The most important question is not how to endure. It is what for. Whoever has a profound reason to live finds the strength to endure even what seems unbearable. And whoever does not have one can lose their way even under favorable circumstances. Meaning is not found, it is created. Philosophical interpretation applied to the human experience. Human life is inevitably marked by moments of rupture, losses, failures, unexpected changes, personal crises, moments when what once seemed stable no longer holds. In those moments, the meaning of the experience is not given in advance. It is created. Some people interpret a crisis as an ending. Others interpret it as a transition. Suffering does not by itself determine the meaning of an experience. It is consciousness that gives it direction. Along those same lines, this book warns us about something broader. When ideas become separated from lived experience, they can become rigid, abstract, incapable of understanding the complexity of human existence. Very often people build ideas about what life should be like, what success should feel like, how happiness should be experienced, how a relationship should be lived. But real life rarely matches those expectations. And that is where the tension appears. Between what we expected and what actually happens. Between the ideal and the real. That distance is not denied. It is not dressed up. It is not reduced. Because in that friction between expectation and reality, consciousness is also formed. If all idols can be questioned, if all certainties can be re-examined, if all truths have a human origin, then an inevitable question arises. What remains standing? And how does a philosophy confront itself when it no longer has external supports? Work number 9, The Antichrist, The Radical Critique of Values and the Problem of the Denial of Life. In 1888, the same year Nietzsche wrote Twilight of the Idols, one of the most controversial works of his entire philosophical career was composed. Its title has generated misunderstandings for more than a century. Many approach this book expecting to find a simple critique of religion. But the issue that runs through it is much deeper. The real interest is not to attack individual faith, nor to judge people's spiritual experiences. What is examined here is the effect that certain systems of values can have on the way human beings understand existence. The question that runs throughout the entire work is this: what kind of life do our values produce? Do they bring us closer to a fuller affirmation of existence? Or do they move us away from it? That is the fundamental question. Not whether a belief is ancient or modern, not whether it is popular or unpopular. but rather what consequences it has for human life. Highlighted quotations. 1. Faith means not wanting to know the truth. Friedrich Nietzsche, The Antichrist, aphorism 52. One of the most provocative statements in all of his work, and one of those that most requires context to be understood. It is not about discrediting every spiritual experience, nor does it deny the religious dimension of human existence. What is questioned is the intellectual attitude that stops investigating because it believes it already possesses all the answers. Philosophical thought demands a permanent willingness to examine, to question, to doubt, to confront even those ideas we value most. The search for truth requires the courage to abandon certainties when they no longer correspond to reality. 2. When the center of gravity of life is placed not in life itself but in the beyond, life as such has been deprived of its center of gravity. Friedrich Nietzsche, The Antichrist, aphorism 43. One of the central ideas of this book. It is not speaking about beliefs in the abstract. It is speaking about something concrete, where we place the weight of our existence. When all attention is directed toward what comes afterward, what is happening now loses its value. Present life becomes something to be endured, a passage toward something considered more important, and in that movement, the concrete experience of existing becomes impoverished. Philosophical interpretation applied to human experience. Beyond the religious sphere, these reflections touch upon a universal human experience. Every human being constructs narratives to explain life, narratives about who we are, about what we deserve, about what we can achieve, about what we consider possible or impossible. We often cling to those narratives because they offer us stability, because they reduce uncertainty, because they allow us to find our bearings. But there comes a moment when some of them no longer describe reality. And then a difficult choice appears. We can continue protecting them, or we can re-examine them. The growth of consciousness begins precisely at that moment, when we choose to understand rather than to protect. A significant part of human suffering arises from struggling against what we are, against our emotions, against our vulnerabilities, against our mistakes, against our imperfections. We try to become an idealized version of ourselves, and in the process, we end up rejecting essential parts of our experience. The direction this book proposes is different. Not perfection, but integration. Not denial, but the lucid acceptance of human complexity. Not an existence free of conflict, but a more conscious relationship with it. The affirmation of oneself and the art of saying yes to one's own life. In 1888, just a few months before silence descended upon the remainder of Nietzsche's conscious existence, he wrote one of the strangest and most personal works in the entire history of philosophy. Work number 10, Ecce Homo, a book that unsettles, a book that provokes, a book that oscillates between autobiography, philosophical reflection, and deliberate provocation. Its chapters bear titles that have bewildered generations of readers. Why I Am So Wise. Why I Am So Clever. Why I Write Such Good Books. At first glance, they may seem like expressions of arrogance. But reducing this work to a display of vanity would mean overlooking something much deeper. This is not about convincing anyone of personal greatness. It is about examining oneself, about retracing the path that was traveled, the experiences that shaped a way of thinking, the sufferings that were endured, the ideas that transformed a way of seeing the world, and, above all, about answering a fundamental question. How can a person become fully reconciled with their own life? Highlighted quotes. 1. To become what one is. Friedrich Nietzsche, Ecce Homo, subtitle of the work. This idea runs through the entire book from beginning to end. Identity is not something fixed. There is no finished essence waiting to be discovered. Human existence is a process, a construction, a continuous transformation. Becoming who one is does not mean finding a definitive answer. It means consciously participating in the creation of oneself. The clumsiness, the mistakes, the seriousness that was wasted, all of it has had value in that process of becoming. 2. My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati. That one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. Friedrich Nietzsche, Ecce Homo, Why I Am So Clever. Amor fati, to love one's fate, but not in the sense of resignation, not in the sense of enduring, not in the sense of accepting because there is no other alternative. Amor fati means something far more demanding. To embrace the totality of one's own life, the successes, the mistakes, the joys, the losses, the moments of fulfillment, and also the moments of darkness, because all of them have taken part in shaping who we are. Not merely to endure what is necessary, not to hide it, but to love it. Philosophical interpretation applied to the human experience. Many people spend much of their lives trying to conform to external models. Models of success, models of happiness, models of recognition, models of personal fulfillment, and in that constant effort to meet other people's expectations, they may end up drifting away from themselves. The question that emerges from this book is not only what we expect from life. It is also what life expects from us. What abilities remain undeveloped, what possibilities remain dormant, what aspects of our existence we have not yet had the courage to explore. There is a profound difference between accepting a life and affirming it. Acceptance may simply mean tolerating it. Affirmation means recognizing that even hardships are part of our story, not because suffering is desirable, not because pain is good in itself, but because denying parts of our experience also means denying ourselves. The possibility proposed by this work is radical. That maturity does not consist in having a perfect life, but in developing the ability to say yes to the reality of one's own life. At the end of this journey through these 10 works, we discover that this philosophy never sought to offer a refuge. It sought to awaken. It did not provide definitive answers. It returned the questions about meaning, about freedom, about values, about identity, about the responsibility of building one's own existence. And perhaps that is why this philosophy continues to be so challenging. Because beyond all the ideas explored, there is one question that transcends time. A question that each person must answer for themselves. What are you doing with the life you have been given?